challenges, I suppose, in the job market at the moment. And as I was saying earlier, they announced the unemployment figures that are, impacting particularly young people in New Zealand. It's tough to get work at the moment, but not just getting any job, but getting a job which gives you the dignity of being able to pay your bills, feed your family, have a place to stay. The difference between having some money and having enough money to live and perhaps even to thrive on. That is the difference between the minimum wage and the living wage. Somebody who is a campaigner for the living wage, Matt Maslin, joins us on the program. Kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Kia ora, thanks for having me.
So, how would you define living wage? I mean, I've given it a rough poke, but how would you define what the living wage actually is?
Yeah, so the comparison to the minimum wage is kind of helpful. Minimum wage isn't the minimum amount that you need to live on. That's the minimal legal requirement to actually pay someone. And so living wage is, also in its name, it's a calculation on how much a person would need to live on realistically. So it gets calculated each year by the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit, an independent research unit, and they update it every year. So from the 1st of September, that figure will be $27.80, and that's based on things like food, rent, petrol, the basics that someone would need to survive, really.
Is there a regional variation in that? Because, I mean, some parts of Aotearoa, it's more expensive to live than others. Is that sort of thing taken into account, or is it sort of averaged across the motu?
As far as I know, it is averaged out across the nation. But yeah, I know, having looked at the breakdowns, it does take into account all the different regions and the cost of living. Because, as you say, living in Auckland is different to living in Dunedin and the costs associated with it.
Yeah, exactly. You swap housing costs for heating costs in some regards, but there we go. I mean, I suppose wanting to look at this from not just an economic point of view, although we'll get to some of that in a moment, no doubt, but looking at this as an ethical principle, that as an employer, if you're paying somebody less than what they need to actually survive in the community in which they live, there is, of course, an ethical component to that.
Yeah, and my view is that wages should help someone escape poverty, not remain trapped in it. And I think that's the problem that we find ourselves in today is, you'll hear lots of people saying, we need to get people into jobs. But then when people do get into jobs, we see this issue of the working poor, essentially. Yeah. And, lots of people are feeling the pinch of the economy at the moment with, high power costs, high petrol costs, high rents, high interest rates. I've got a picky toddler who loves to eat cucumber. It's one of her favorite foods. Yeah. It costs $7 for a cucumber.
My goodness.
Granted, out of season, but $7 for a cucumber at the moment. A block of butter, I've seen that in the news, $10. Blocks of cheese must be up to $80. I'm not sure what they go for anymore. But these are things that significantly impact low wage earners. And, having spent some time at the City Mission, the impact of that can be quite extreme and relatively undignified for people who are struggling at the moment. And so I'm feeling some of the economic pressure of what's going on at the moment. And I'm lucky enough to be on a living wage.
Exactly. But you've also got a toddler with a cucumber habit. Who doesn't understand seasonal vegetables. Exactly.
It's better than chicken nuggets.
Well, yeah, it is. There is an upside of that. I mean, I suppose jumping into the economics of this, because I mean, there's two people involved in this equation. Yes, there is high unemployment at the moment. The other thing that is being reported economically is an increase in businesses that just aren't breaking even at the moment, who are going under and are just needing to lay off all of their staff. to put that extra burden on the employer and say, hey, you need to pay this much in order to make this ethical principle of a living wage. For some employers, that's going to be the breaking point. For some employers, that's going to be, well, I can't trade under those conditions because my competitors aren't doing that, and everyone's going to lose their job, and I'm going to lose my business.
Yeah, and that's totally understandable. A lot of the research does show that there are good reasons for employers to pay the living wage as well. It increases productivity. You get a higher rate of retention. So there are some benefits for employers as well.
Yeah.
This isn't a mandated thing from the government. This is at the moment something that people can opt into, although we are seeing quite a big uptake in people paying the living wage. But, I mean, there is an ethical problem around having a business that isn't paying people enough to live on. And so we've really got to keep that balance in mind of, we want businesses to flourish, but we don't also want to create a society in which businesses exist at the expense of people's well-being. And the research shows that when we kind of bridge the gap between the rich and the poor in a society, we have more stable communities, we have reduced violence and crime, increased life expectancy, we improve social mobility, we generate trust. There's all these benefits. And living wage isn't, the answer to bridging that gap, but it's a step along the way, I think.
Certainly, and certainly there's an economic benefit as well to having staff who are paid enough that they're motivated, that they're not always looking for another job, that you're not having to spend your time and expenses in recruiting staff or not having the staff that you need to get the job done. There is a little bit of inflationary pressure on at the moment, and I know the Reserve Bank, their big job is to put pressure on interest rates, and I don't totally know how it works, Matt, to be honest. But again, the economic argument might be that that living wage just fuels the fire when it comes to inflationary pressures, that in order to pay the living wage, the businesses put their prices up, and that just chases its own tail. Any thoughts or responses to that?
Yeah, I don't think that's what we're seeing at the moment with employers that are implementing the living wage. And I think it's important as well to be thinking about employers of services rather than just products.
Yep.
The current movement at the moment in the living wage movement, Aotearoa, is to do living wage in schools, not for teachers. Teachers already get a relatively okay living wage, but for cleaners, caretakers, canteen staff, groundskeepers, we're pushing for them to be paid the living wage, which would, for them, on average, be an extra $180 a fortnight for them, which tells you how little they're being paid at the moment. And this is a really unfortunate thing, because schools, yes, we're educating our young people, but we're also forming them into kind of moral creatures as well. Yeah. And to be doing that in an environment where we're not paying people fairly or justly, I think is highly unfortunate. So the movement at the moment is focusing on this issue in particular, and trying to kind of these people just don't have the same kind of pay equity mechanisms that other people might have. Yep. And so it's helpful for us to kind of step in there and advocate for them. And we're encouraging the government to pay targeted funding to state and integrated schools so that they can get paid what they're worth, essentially.
What's your connection with the living wage movement? What motivated you to be involved with this, Matt?
Yeah, well, I've always been quite interested in the connection between economics and theology and justice. I've worked for the Salvation Army. I work in the city now at the cathedral, and so I see a lot of the bottom of the hill kind of stuff with people,
Yeah.
and I love doing that kind of work. But along the way, I've been thinking, how have we created a society in which these circumstances exist? And so now I'm starting to get interested in kind of challenging the economic structures that create these kind of situations. But this is motivated by my faith, and actually there's a Ches Muir, he's at the cathedral and one of my colleagues, and he was involved from the outset of the living wage in the country. And he told me once someone said to him, Ches, I hear you're a bit of a Christian. And he said, oh, you heard wrong. I'm a whole lot of Christian. I'm not a bit of Christian. And for him, his faith was the motivator to seeking justice for the working poor and for people to get paid fairly. And I think there's a pretty solid, unavoidable biblical mandate for this as well. God seems to quite often challenge systems that institutionalize the exploitation of the poor, essentially.
Yeah.
And there's the Old Testament practice of gleaning, which is an interesting kind of manifestation of God's attitude towards the poor. And even though ancient cultures were agriculturally less productive, they would leave the margins of their grain fields unharvested. They wouldn't pick up any produce that fell to the ground. They would harvest their vineyards just once a year, and so. And kind of the excess from that was given to the poor or for foreigners who couldn't have their own land.
Yeah.
And it's kind of summed up in this passage in Deuteronomy 24, where it says you shouldn't oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy.
Yeah.
And so these kind of Old Testament practices find their foundation in wider theological ideas, such as all people being made in the image of God and us being essentially aliens to creation, and we're stewarding what's God and distributing that in a fair way. And then obviously Jesus kind of incarnates God's attitudes towards not just how we treat the poor, but how we think about labor. Parable of the generous landowner. There's an interesting contrast in Luke. Jesus says the laborer deserves his wages.
Mm-hmm.
In Matthew, he says the laborer deserves his food. And those are interesting things thinking about in today's economy. But more generally, the love of neighbor doesn't stop where wages begin, it extends into that conversation.
And even the theological principle of seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. I mean, this is basically caring for our fellow man, and we'll seeing God's divinity within them in that regard. Something you mentioned earlier that I wanted to circle back to, actually, you said that this isn't mandatory. This is a voluntary code, that this isn't something which is legislated, that employers must pay the living wage. Do you think that should change? What's your view on that, Matt?
Well, I think we're kind of getting to a stage in which that might have to happen. We've been trusting institutions, banks, supermarkets, petrol companies to do the right thing and to pay people fairly, and they haven't. And so what do we do about that? It seems to be getting more and more extreme. We saw over the pandemic massive windfalls for all of those institutions, and they didn't share their wealth. And right now we're seeing Countdown employees ask for the living wage, and Countdown, Woolworths, they're making less than they have in the last couple of years, but the amount of money they made in the last couple of years is absolutely exorbitant.
And these were our COVID heroes, the supermarket workers, really.
Exactly. Exactly. And COVID was a really interesting time to think about, who are the important people in our, who are the important laborers in our culture, essentially. And we have a tendency in the West to prioritize intellectual labor over manual labor. And something I find interesting about Jesus is Jesus was a manual laborer. He, grew up as a carpenter, but in the earliest depiction of Jesus, there was a drawing of him on a wall in an early house church. Jesus is wearing the philosopher's robes.
Okay.
And so to me, Jesus kind of encapsulates and affirms both manual labor, this carpenter who uses his hands, and also intellectual labor, this philosopher, this rabbi, this teacher. And he affirms the goodness of both of these things, and affirms both the goodness of using our minds and using our hands.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good challenge to a culture in which we tend to prioritize kind of thinking labor over manual labor.
Whether you're a teacher or a caretaker, you deserve the dignity of being able to pay your bills and support your family in that regard. Well, hey, we could talk much longer on this topic, but certainly some food for thought. Matt, thank you for what you do. Thanks very much for joining us on the program today.
Cheers. Thank you so much. See you, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.